Reinebringen in the Lofoten Islands. 666 meters from the beginning of the trail to the top of the mountain. It's a trail I've wanted to do since I first saw photographs of Lofoten. It's not particularly high in terms of elevation gain. It's not particularly long in terms of distance, but it is steep. Constant climbing, one foot in front of the other until we get to the top. So made it to the top, and the view is that's one of the most impressive views I've ever seen in my life. It's about 8 o'clock here now, and we've been here an hour. We're just waiting to see what the light does, how the light changes. Sun doesn't set till about 11:30, and the best light's going to be probably from about 9:30. That's what it's been like so far when we've been out on other hikes. So it doesn't have that really golden hue yet. There's not really much warmth in the sky. It still feels a little bit blue and high contrast. But we don't really know because there's so many peaks in the air. There's a lot of heavy cloud on the horizon to the north. It could be that we just lose the light completely. The sun could drop behind a cloud or drop behind a peak, and then everything gets cast into shadow. When we first got up, there was a lot of shadow on the peaks just directly behind me, so the image doesn't work. So we're going to wait, see what the light does. So we've got hot tea and water to keep hydrated. We've got sandwiches and protein bars and lots of layers to keep warm. And then when we've had enough, we're going to go back down those thousands of steps back to the van. That'll be fun. These are a couple of images that I captured when the light was still really good. Now you can see in this image, there's really nice light on the mountains in the background, but most of the foreground is in shadow. So all around the mountain in the foreground, and most of the islands as well. Whereas this image taken slightly later, just when the sun had moved around a little bit. For me, it's a lot more dynamic here because we can see the light on the islands in front. It just gives the whole image a lot more depth. Also, the composition, I think, is better here. You can see the islands on the right are fully captured in the frame, whereas in the previous image, they've been cut off because I was too focused here on using the mountain in the center as my focal point. So I built the whole composition around that. And I was trying to get the lake in the bottom as well. And that kind of distracted me, and I ended up cutting off the islands on the right. So I do prefer this image. I do prefer it with the better light. It has a better composition. Although when I took this, when the sun had moved around, it was about 15 minutes later. The sky isn't as interesting. There's not as much going on in the sky here. I think the clouds have disappeared a little bit, and it just doesn't, there's not as much drama in the sky. Now eventually, as the sun moved down and just before it went down behind the mountains, we did hit the peak light, which was just a really good time for shooting when you've got that really golden light, that last light of the day. Now this is the image that I managed to shoot in that peak light. It's actually not just one image, it's 3 images stitched together to make a panorama because I wanted to get the whole sweep of the mountains. And it was also really important to me to get the sunstar in, and I didn't want to have the sunstar right on the edge of the frame. Now composing like that meant I also got a lot of shadow in the bottom left corner, you know, that whole of the lake there in the backside of that mountain. The light's not touching there because the sun's behind it, so you do have a large area of shadow in the bottom left. I'm not particularly happy with that from a compositional point of view. And just before the sun hit the horizon, pretty much all of the clouds disappeared. So what you're really relying on the light here to do a lot of heavy lifting. It's really all about the way that the light's interacting with those mountains and just the sheer, the grandeur of the scene and how impressive this particular location is. Now, I really pushed the highlights. This is actually, I did shoot it, bracketed, and then blended the images together. So there isn't actually any clipping here, but I really did push the highlights, the brightness, right to as far as I could go without it clipping, because I really did want to get that feel of just the sun saturating and really lighting the whole of the scene there, that drama of the last light just before it dips behind the mountains. But I'm really not sure if I prefer this image or the images that I took a little bit earlier. There's a lot of shadow here. Not as much of the scene is lit up. And while some scenes work well when the sun's gone down and you get into the blue hour and you get a lot more shadow in the scene, some images, some locations really work much better when you have a lot of golden light, when there's a lot more, when certain elements in the scene are being picked out by light. Because when you get so much shadow, then you start to lose depth because everything has a kind of same tonal value. So here, while I like the sun star, I love the scene. I love the way that the light feels, just how saturated it is. But I do feel that the image that I took earlier is actually probably a better image. Once the light had gone, it was time to head back down all these steps, back down to the car. Now, these stone steps that have been put up there in the last few years, they have made the ascent and the descent a lot easier than it used to be when it was just a muddy trail. But these steps, they're hard on the knees. By the time you get to the bottom, your legs are pretty much like jelly. It really, really does hit you hard, just these constant steps going down. Now, Reinebringen wasn't the only hike we did in Lofoten. We did quite a few others, and one that we did when we had particularly good light was a hike over to the Kvalvika beach. This is a relatively easy hike. It's just a few hundred meters ascent up and through the saddle of the mountain and back down onto this beach. And being here, it really is amazing. We had incredible light. This beach just sweeps around and faces into the Atlantic. There's no roads here. There's no car park. There are no buildings here. It's a really wild beach. And it's just a wonderful place to spend some time, to walk around and just really feel the atmosphere of the place. Now, capturing a place like this, there's a few things to take into consideration. First of all, you need your focal point. And my focal point here was always going to be this kind of pyramid-shaped rock that's kind of on the other side of the beach. Your eye naturally is drawn to that rock. It's a wonderful shape, and it just makes a really good visual anchor for the image. But to give the image depth, you need something in the foreground. You need something to balance against that, something to interact with it. There has to be some kind of harmony within the image. There has to be some depth, some way of giving the landscape scale. So the first thing that I did was look around on the beach to see if I could find anything that worked. I looked around to see there were some streams of water and things like that were flowing down, but they didn't really work. They were flowing in the wrong direction. They just weren't what I was looking for. So in the end, we kind of climbed up a little bit on the bank, and I found this rock and just decided that the best way to give this some scale, to really give that idea of the wildness of the place, of the size of the place, just that epic feel of nature, was just to put myself standing on the rock. So I set the camera up on automatic. It was taking a photograph every 5 seconds and just walked down onto the rock and posed there. And it does, wearing a red jacket, it really does give a splash of color and just gives something, there's an interaction there between the figure and the anchor point of the cliff in the background. Our eye kind of moves between the two, and it creates a dynamism in the image. And the other thing about this, again, was making sure I captured the sweep of the light coming in from the right. I really wanted to have that feel of just this golden light, this Arctic summer light, just coming horizontally across the landscape, really picking out the details in the beach, really just backlighting the grass. Now, when the light's this low, it really does help to give a very strong sense of depth. It picks out certain aspects of the image that are facing towards the light, while others drop into shadow, and it just really saturates the color. So there's a really strong directionality of the light that I really wanted to bring out. And again, I used the shadow in the bottom of the frame here, where the light wasn't touching, as a framing device, because again, that just helps move your eye out. Your eye will jump over the shadow and move towards the light, towards the lit part of the areas. So you can use areas of shadow like in the bottom of the frame here as a framing device, just to help move your eye through the image towards the areas that you want people to focus on. And finally, the last big hike we did on the trip was the incredible 10-kilometer Munkebu Trail. Now, it's places like this, these wild, remote places, that really do inspire me and what push me to get out and photograph. I just love the feeling of being in these remote, incredibly beautiful places. Now, on this particular day, It was raining, it was muddy. The trail was quite a long one. It's quite tough with a lot of gain. My partner on these workshops is Jonas, who's a Swedish mountain guide. I really do love working with him because he does push me a lot harder. This is probably a trail that I wouldn't have taken a workshop group without him. But having someone there who really knows the mountains, who can push you, really does help a lot. And this place is absolutely magnificent. When we got to the end of the trail, you see these 3 lakes here at these different levels below this mountain peak. It really is stunning. So trying to capture that, trying to work out a way in which to capture these different, just this really incredible landscape that's spread out before you, is part of the challenge of composition, I think. You've got these different lakes, you've got this peak, and you're trying to arrange all of these different elements into a coherent frame. So it's not visual chaos. Your eye doesn't wander around everywhere. So you start with your anchor point, with your focal point, which for me was this mountain at the background. I had to wait for that to be cleared of the clouds. There's a lot of heavy cloud in the sky, and that peak was often hidden. So I was waiting for the moment when that was clear, and then using the finding a place where the lakes worked as stepping stones, leading the eye towards that. And then once again, I used a figure there. I went down and stepped into the frame myself because I liked the frame without it. It did work without it. It was very wild, but I liked the splash of color. And again, I liked the feeling of just scale that you get from having this small figure in this huge landscape. It's something that helps communicate that epic sense, that epic feeling. So the main thing here also in terms of composition was not being distracted with the foreground. The foreground here wasn't particularly interesting, so I gave up trying to find a nice arrangement of rocks which would help lead your eye into it. So that's something that I would often do with a wide angle shot, but this had so many elements with the 3 different lakes that I didn't feel it needed more of a foreground. It would have just been too much. It would have made the whole image overwhelming. Now, I'm not super happy with the left side of the image, that big rock face that's above the first lake. It's a little bit strong, it's a little bit uninteresting, and it does have a lot of visual weight. So I'm not quite sure if this image would have worked better as a vertical or as a square. But I really do like letterbox crops. I tend to use them a lot. This isn't actually shot as a multi-image panorama. It's one image that I've cropped down a little bit to give it that letterbox feel, because I really did feel there were a lot of horizontals with the lakes here. But that's really it. There's not a lot going on here with exposure. It wasn't a particularly complicated image to expose for. We don't have directional light like we had in the previous images. You're not dealing with a high dynamic range here. But this is one of those places that is so strong. These different lakes, the size of the landscape here, these different mountains. I didn't really feel it needed that strong directional light. I actually liked the moodiness of the landscape here. I liked the heavy clouds, the feeling of just this dark, moody landscape. And I think it's important to remember that in landscape photography, you don't always need brilliant light. You can shoot pretty much in any light. This image was taken pretty much in the middle of the afternoon. The previous images were taken around about midnight when we had the midnight sun, but not this one. It's right in the middle of a cloudy afternoon. And it shouldn't be that light is always the thing that decides when you can and when you can't shoot. I'm a strong believer in that you capture how the landscape makes you feel, and the way that the landscape is interacting with the weather and with the light is a big part of that. And sometimes moody, cloudy weather does really, really work for landscapes. And I really do think that's often the case in places like Lofoten and also places like Iceland.
And I think that's it for this video. I'm at Oslo airport now, about to go home, but I'll be heading to Iceland in a couple of weeks, and I'll be back again in Lofoten next year. So if you'd like to join me, on a workshop, you can join me in Lofoten. I'll be back in Iceland. I've got trips to the Dolomites, to Namibia, to Patagonia, to Greenland, and I'm also just putting into place plans for a trip to Kenya in next year or the year after, I'm not sure when. And if you're interested in any of those, there's full information on my website, or you can drop me an email, and I'd love to have you join me on a trip. And as ever, thanks so much for watching and supporting the channel, and good luck with your own photography. See ya!